The morning started like any other Thursday in our quiet suburban home. I had been married to Robert for 42 years, and in all that time, I thought I knew every corner of our life together. The bills came to our address, the bank statements arrived on schedule, and we had our routines. Coffee at 7, breakfast by 8, Robert reading his newspaper while I sorted through the mail. But that Thursday morning in October, everything I believed about my marriage, about trust, about the man sleeping beside me for over 4 decades, started to unravel with a single piece of mail addressed only to me. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock paper, the kind that carries weight before you even open it. Financial Oversight Bureau, it said in raised lettering across the top. Account audit statement enclosed. My name was printed clearly on the address label. Margaret Ellen Thornton, not Mr. and Mrs. Robert Thornton, not Robert and Margaret, just me, alone. And I had no idea why a financial auditor would be sending me anything at all. I remember standing in our kitchen, the one Robert and I had remodeled 15 years ago when we thought we had everything figured out. The morning light came through the window above the sink, catching dust particles in the air, and I could smell the coffee brewing in the pot, that familiar aroma that usually brought comfort. But comfort was the last thing I felt as I slid my finger under the envelope flap and pulled out the document inside. My reading glasses hung on a chain around my neck, and I lifted them to my face with hands that wouldn't quite steady themselves. The header read clearly enough. Account Audit Summary. Beneficial Owner Investigation. Account Holder of Record, Margaret Ellen Thornton. Secondary Signatory, Robert James Thornton. And then, in bold print that seemed to jump off the page, the words that made my stomach drop. Total account balance, as of September 30th, $847,392 and 16s, $847,000, in an account I had never heard of, never opened, never touched, but somehow legally it was in my name. I read the document 3 times, each word sinking in slower than the last. The account had been opened 23 years ago at a regional bank I barely remembered, one that had merged with 2 other institutions since then. Regular deposits, the statement showed, ranging from $3,000 to $12,000, made quarterly without fail. Withdrawal history, minimal. The account had just sat there, growing, accumulating interest, building into a sum that represented more money than Robert and I had saved together in our entire marriage, or so I thought. My mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Had Robert been hiding money from me for over 2 decades? Was this some kind of inheritance he never mentioned? A business deal gone right that he kept secret? Or worse, was it something illegal, something that would bring federal investigators to our door? The audit notice mentioned compliance review and beneficial ownership verification under new banking regulations. They wanted me to confirm my relationship to the account and provide documentation of the fund's origin. They gave me 30 days to respond. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope, my thoughts spinning in circles I couldn't quite catch. Robert was still asleep upstairs. He had retired 3 years ago from his job as a middle manager at a manufacturing company, the same place he had worked for 37 years. We lived on his pension and our Social Security, comfortable enough, but nowhere near wealthy. We drove a 12-year-old sedan. We clipped coupons. We had never taken an extravagant vacation, never splurged on anything beyond what seemed reasonable and responsible. And now, apparently, we had been sitting on nearly $1 million I knew nothing about. The coffee pot beeped, pulling me back to the moment. I poured myself a cup, with hands that still shook slightly, the ceramic mug warm against my palms. I had given 42 years to this marriage, raised 3 children in this house, built what I thought was a partnership based on honesty and shared dreams. The photograph on the refrigerator showed Robert and me on our 40th anniversary, smiling at a restaurant our children had treated us to, celebrating what everyone called a milestone of love and commitment. I stared at that photo now, at Robert's face frozen in that moment of celebration, and wondered what else I didn't know about the man I had promised my life to. The thing about discovering a secret this big is that it changes everything retroactively. Suddenly, every conversation we'd had about money, every decision we'd made about saving or spending, every time I worried about whether we'd have enough for retirement or medical emergencies, all of it felt like a lie. Or at least, like I had been living in a version of reality that wasn't quite true. I thought about the times I had clipped coupons to save $3 on groceries, The winter I had kept the thermostat low to save on heating bills, the modest gifts at Christmas because we needed to be practical. And all the while this account existed, fat with money I didn't know we had. I needed to think clearly, but my emotions kept getting in the way. Anger was there, hot and sharp, making my jaw clench. Betrayal sat heavy in my chest like a stone. But there was also confusion, genuine bewilderment about how this could have happened, what it meant, and why Robert would have done this. We weren't the kind of couple who kept secrets. At least, I hadn't thought we were. Robert came downstairs around 8:30, dressed in his usual retirement uniform of khaki pants and a polo shirt, his gray hair still damp from the shower. He smiled at me, that same comfortable smile he'd given me for decades, and asked if there was any coffee left. I poured him a cup, my movements automatic, and watched him add cream and sugar. 2 spoons, just like always. Everything was so normal, so routine, except for the envelope sitting on the counter between us like a landmine waiting to explode. I didn't say anything right away. Part of me wanted to throw the statement at him, to demand an explanation immediately. But another part, the part that had learned patience through years of marriage and motherhood, told me to wait, to think, to understand what I was dealing with before I confronted him. So I smiled back, a tight smile that probably didn't reach my eyes, and I told him I had some errands to run that morning. I needed space to process this, to figure out my next move. I drove to the public library, a place Robert would never think to look for me. The building was quiet on a Thursday morning, just a few people browsing the stacks and some students using the computers. I found a corner table near the reference section and took out the audit statement again, reading it more carefully this time. The account had been opened in January of 2002 at First Community Bank, which later became Regional Financial Group, which then merged into what was now called United Trust Bank. The opening deposit had been $15,000. After that, deposits came quarterly, like clockwork, each one between $3,000 and $12,000. I did the math in my head. 23 years of quarterly deposits averaging maybe $7,000 each. That was roughly $644,000 in contributions alone. The rest, about $200,000, had come from interest and investment growth. Whoever was funding this account had been disciplined, consistent, and patient. This wasn't a one-time windfall or a lucky break. This was systematic wealth accumulation over more than 2 decades. The question that burned in my mind was simple. Where had the money come from? Robert's salary at the manufacturing company had been decent, but not extraordinary. We had always lived within our means, or so I thought. Could he have been skimming money from his paychecks all these years without me noticing? Had he inherited something he never told me about? Was he running some kind of side business I didn't know existed? I thought back to 2002, trying to remember what our life had been like when this account was opened. Our youngest, Emily, had just started college that year. Our older 2, David and Patricia, were already out of the house, starting their own lives. Robert had gotten a small promotion around that time, I remembered, moving into a management position that came with a modest raise. We had celebrated with dinner at a steakhouse. Nothing fancy, just a nice evening out. But nothing about that time suggested extra money. Certainly not $15,000 to open an account I knew nothing about. I sat in that library for 3 hours, trying to piece together a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The longer I sat, the more questions multiplied in my mind. Why was the account in my name if I didn't know about it? Was Robert trying to hide assets from someone else, using me as a legal shield? Was this money legitimate, or was I somehow implicated in something I didn't understand? The audit notice had mentioned beneficial ownership verification, which I understood from my limited knowledge of financial news meant they were trying to determine who really controlled the account and where the money came from. New regulations, apparently, designed to prevent money laundering and fraud. The thought that I might be unknowingly involved in something illegal made my hands go cold. I had worked my entire adult life as a substitute teacher and later as a librarian's assistant, never making much money but always being honest, paying my taxes, following the rules. The idea that my name was attached to nearly $1 million of questionable origin terrified me more than the betrayal itself. By the time I drove home that afternoon, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Robert directly, not yet. Instead, I was going to do what the auditors were asking me to do. I was going to investigate this account, trace its history, and figure out exactly what I was dealing with. Only then would I decide how to handle my husband and whatever secrets he had been keeping. But little did I know, the investigation I was about to start would uncover far more than I ever imagined. Secrets that stretched back decades and involved people I thought I knew better than anyone. That evening, Robert was unusually chatty during dinner. We had baked chicken and roasted vegetables, a meal I had made 1,000 times before, and he talked about his plans to clean out the garage this weekend, about the neighbor's new dog, about mundane things that suddenly felt surreal against the backdrop of what I knew and he didn't know I knew. I played along, nodding at the right moments, asking appropriate questions, while my mind worked through strategies for uncovering the truth. After dinner, while Robert settled into his recliner to watch television, I went to our home office, a small room off the hallway that we used for bill paying and computer work. We had one filing cabinet where we kept important documents, tax returns, insurance papers, that sort of thing. I started there, pulling out folders and looking for anything that might mention the account. But there was nothing. Our tax returns showed only the income and interest I knew about. Our bank statements from the checking and savings accounts we shared showed balances that matched what I expected. It was as if this other account existed in a parallel universe, completely separate from our documented financial life. I opened the computer and searched through Robert's email, feeling guilty but justified given the circumstances. He wasn't particularly tech-savvy and used the same password for everything, a combination of his birth year and our street address that I had known for years. His inbox was mostly newsletters and spam, with occasional messages from our children or his former co-workers. I scrolled back through months of emails, looking for anything from banks or financial institutions I didn't recognize. Nothing stood out. Then I tried searching for specific terms: account, audit, statement, deposit. The search came back empty. If Robert was communicating about this secret account, he wasn't doing it through email, or at least not through the email address I knew about. The possibility that he had another email account, another layer of secrecy, made my stomach churn. I closed the computer and sat back in the desk chair, staring at the wall where we had hung our family photos. There was our wedding picture from 1983, both of us so young and hopeful. Photos of our children at various ages, graduations and birthdays and holidays. Pictures of grandchildren, 4 of them now, ranging from infant to 8 years old. This wall represented our life together, the family we had built, the memories we had created. How did a secret worth nearly $1 million fit into this picture? Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay next to Robert, listening to his steady breathing, wondering who this man really was. In the darkness, doubts crept in that I hadn't allowed during the day. What if this was connected to another woman? What if Robert had been leading a double life, supporting someone else, building a nest egg for a future that didn't include me? The thought made my chest tight with a pain that went beyond anger into something closer to grief. But even as these dark thoughts swirled, another part of me pushed back. Robert wasn't that kind of man, was he? He came home every night. We ate dinner together. We watched television together. We went to church on Sundays. He helped me with the dishes. He called when he was going to be late. He had been a good father to our children, present and involved. He remembered my birthday and our anniversary. This didn't fit the profile of someone living a secret life, and yet the account existed. The money was real. The secrecy was undeniable. Friday morning arrived with pale sunlight and the same routine. Coffee, breakfast, the newspaper. I moved through the motions, playing my role, while my mind spun with questions. I had called the number on the audit statement the day before, reaching an automated system that asked me to schedule an appointment with an auditor. The earliest available slot was Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, 4 days away. 4 days to live with this secret, to watch my husband and wonder what he was hiding. I decided to approach this systematically. First, I needed to understand the account itself, its history and transactions. Second, I needed to trace where the money came from. Third, I needed to figure out why it was in my name. And finally, I needed to decide what to do with the information once I had it. Each step required careful planning and discretion. I couldn't afford to tip off Robert before I understood what I was dealing with. On Saturday, while Robert was outside working in the garage as he had promised, I went back to the home office and pulled out our old tax returns, going back as far as we had them. The filing cabinet held returns for the past 10 years, but I knew we had older ones stored in boxes in the basement. I hauled up 3 dusty cardboard boxes marked with years in black marker and spread the documents out on the floor. I started with 2002, the year the account was opened. Our joint income that year had been $68,000, mostly from Robert's salary with a small contribution from my part-time work at the library. We had claimed 3 dependents, our youngest still in college and qualifying for educational credits. Standard deductions, nothing unusual. No mention of any account or interest income beyond our regular savings account at the local bank. I moved through the years methodically, looking for any irregularity, any hint of additional income that might explain where Robert was getting money to deposit into the secret account. But year after year, the returns showed consistent, predictable finances. Robert's salary increased gradually with promotions and cost of living adjustments. My income stayed modest but steady. We paid our taxes, claimed appropriate deductions, and nothing jumped out as suspicious or hidden. This presented a new puzzle. If the money wasn't coming from unreported income, where was it coming from? The quarterly deposits averaging $7,000 would have been noticeable in our household budget. That was a significant chunk of money, especially in the early 2000s when Robert's salary wasn't as high as it became later. We couldn't have been hiding that much from our regular expenses without me noticing, could we? Unless, I thought with growing unease, the money was coming from somewhere that didn't need to be reported as income. An inheritance, maybe. Though I couldn't remember Robert receiving anything substantial from his parents when they passed. His mother had died in 1997, his father in 2004, and while they had left some money to their children, Robert's share had been maybe $30,000, which we had used to pay off the mortgage early. We had celebrated that, I remembered clearly, the freedom of owning our home outright. So where else could money come from that wouldn't show up on tax returns? The possibilities that came to mind weren't comforting. Cash businesses that operated off the books, under-the-table deals, maybe even illegal activities. I tried to imagine Robert involved in anything criminal and couldn't make the picture fit. He was steady, predictable, maybe even boring in his routines and habits. He had worked at the same company for decades, coming home at the same time every evening. He didn't gamble. He didn't drink much beyond an occasional beer. He didn't have expensive hobbies or interests. He was, by all appearances, exactly what he seemed to be, a responsible middle-class man living a responsible middle-class life. Except, apparently, he wasn't. I heard the garage door opening and quickly gathered up the tax returns, stuffing them back into their boxes. Robert came in through the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag, looking satisfied with whatever progress he had made, organizing his tools and equipment. He smiled at me, asked if I wanted to go out for lunch, and I agreed, keeping my voice normal and pleasant, while my thoughts continued their frantic spinning. We went to a diner we had been going to for years, a place with red vinyl booths and waitresses who knew our usual orders. I had a turkey club sandwich. Robert had a burger with fries. We talked about our grandchildren, about Emily's new job in marketing, about David's upcoming business trip to Atlanta. Normal conversation, comfortable and familiar, while I studied my husband's face across the table and wondered what he was hiding behind those kind eyes and weathered features. He looked his age, 64, with gray hair thinning on top and reading glasses he now needed for menus and newspapers. His hands showed spots from the sun, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose knees weren't as flexible as they used to be. This was the man I had grown old with, whose face I had watched change over 4 decades, from young to middle-aged to elderly. I knew the scar on his left hand from a workshop accident 20 years ago. I knew he preferred his coffee strong and his steaks medium rare. I knew he got emotional during certain movies, and that he always teared up at weddings. How could I know all these intimate details about a person and still not know something this fundamental about his financial life? The auditor appointment on Tuesday loomed in my mind like a deadline. I had 3 more days to gather whatever information I could before I had to sit down with officials and explain an account I didn't understand. The audit notice had been clear. I needed to provide documentation about the source of funds and my relationship to the account. If I couldn't do that, there could be legal consequences. The money could be frozen. Investigations could be opened. My name was on that account, which meant I was legally responsible for whatever it represented. That realization hit me harder than it should have. I was responsible, not just morally implicated in Robert's secret, but legally liable for whatever this account meant. If the money was illegitimate, If it came from something illegal or fraudulent, I could face penalties. I could face charges. The injustice of that possibility made anger flare hot in my chest. I had done nothing wrong, known nothing about this, and yet I was the one whose name was on the paperwork, the one the auditors wanted to question. On Sunday, we went to church like we did every week. We sat in our usual pew, near the middle on the right side. We sang the hymns. We listened to the sermon. Something about forgiveness and grace that felt painfully ironic given my current state of mind. Afterward, we lingered in the fellowship hall for coffee and cookies, chatting with people we had known for years. Margaret and Robert Thornton, the stable couple, married forever, pillars of quiet consistency in our small community. Mrs. Henderson, who was 83 and had been attending this church since before I was born, grabbed my hand with her papery fingers and told me how blessed I was to have such a devoted husband. Robert was helping some younger men move tables at the other end of the hall, and she gestured toward him with obvious approval. "A good man," she said, "the kind you don't find anymore." I smiled and nodded and felt like a fraud, like I was participating in a performance where I didn't know all my lines. That evening, I made one more attempt to find answers before my Tuesday appointment. I went through Robert's wallet while he was in the shower, looking for any cards or papers I didn't recognize. His driver's license, his insurance card, his credit card that we shared, a few business cards from people he had worked with, and his membership card to the hardware store. Nothing unusual. I checked his car next, opening the glove compartment and looking under the seats. The owner's manual, some insurance paperwork, a few napkins from fast food restaurants, and an ice scraper. Again, nothing that suggested a secret life or hidden accounts. I was running out of places to look and running out of time. Tuesday morning was approaching, and I still had no answers, no documentation, no explanation for why $847,000 existed in my name without my knowledge. The weight of that reality pressed down on me until I felt I could barely breathe under it. Monday night, I made a decision. I was going to tell Robert about the audit notice, not because I wanted to give him a chance to explain before the appointment, although that was part of it, but mostly because I realized I couldn't walk into that meeting blind and unprepared, especially if Robert had answers that could help me understand the situation. Whatever secrets he had been keeping, they were about to be exposed anyway. The auditors wouldn't stop their investigation just because I played dumb. Better to confront him now, privately, than to have everything blow up in front of federal officials. But I didn't get the chance. Tuesday morning arrived faster than I wanted it to, and Robert was up early, already dressed by the time I came downstairs. He had coffee made and was sitting at the kitchen table with a serious expression that immediately put me on alert. The audit notice was on the table in front of him. My heart stopped. He had found it. Somehow he had found the letter I had hidden in my desk drawer, and now he was sitting there with evidence of his secret spread out between us. I stood in the doorway, frozen, trying to read his expression. Was he angry that I had discovered his secret? Was he preparing to defend himself? To explain? To lie? The moment stretched out, tense and loaded with unspoken accusations from both sides. But then Robert looked up at me, and what I saw in his face wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was fear, real, genuine fear that made his hands shake as he picked up the audit notice and held it toward me. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "we need to talk about something I should have told you 23 years ago." My legs felt weak. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, my hands folded on the table to keep them from trembling. The moment I had been dreading and anticipating for days had arrived, but not in any way I had imagined. Robert wasn't caught. He was confessing, and somehow that made it worse. He took a deep breath, the kind you take before diving into cold water, and he started to talk. The account, he said, was real. The money was real. And yes, he had opened it in my name 23 years ago, without telling me. But the reason, he said, wasn't what I might think. It wasn't another woman. It wasn't illegal activity. It wasn't even really about hiding money from me. Not in the way I probably imagined. He paused, gathering his words, and I waited, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "The money," Robert said slowly, "came from his brother." His brother? I stared at him, confused. Robert's brother, Thomas, had died almost 25 years ago in a car accident. He had been 2 years younger than Robert, never married, and had worked as an engineer for some technology company I couldn't remember the name of. We had gone to his funeral, mourned his loss, and moved on with our lives. What did Thomas have to do with an account opened 2 years after his death? Robert's eyes were wet as he explained. Thomas hadn't just been an engineer, he clarified. He had been one of the early employees at a startup that developed software for telecommunications, something technical that Robert never fully understood. But when the company went public in the late 90s, Thomas's stock options had made him wealthy. Very wealthy. He had never told the family exactly how much money he had, preferring to live modestly and quietly. But when he died suddenly in that accident in 2000, his will revealed the extent of his estate. Thomas had been worth nearly $3 million, and he had left almost all of it to Robert, his only surviving sibling. Their parents were already gone, and Thomas had no children, no wife, no other close relatives. Robert was named as the sole beneficiary. I absorbed this information slowly, trying to make sense of it. If Robert had inherited $3 million from his brother, why hadn't he told me? Why hide it? Why create a secret account in my name instead of just sharing the windfall with his wife? Robert must have seen the questions in my face because he continued talking, his words coming faster now, almost desperate in their need to make me understand. He said that when Thomas died and the inheritance came through, Robert had been overwhelmed. $3 million was more money than he had ever imagined having. It was generational wealth, life-changing wealth, and he had been terrified of what it might do to our family. Our children were in their 20s at the time, he reminded me. David was just starting his career. Patricia was newly married. Emily was heading to college. Robert had watched other families torn apart by sudden wealth, siblings fighting over inheritance, children becoming entitled and unmotivated, marriages strained by disagreements over money. He had been afraid that if our children knew about the inheritance, it would change their relationship with us, with each other, with their own ambitions and work ethics. But more than that, Robert said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, he had been afraid of what it might change in me. That statement hit like a slap. What did he mean? What it might change in me? I had never been materialistic. I had never pressured him for more money or complained about our middle-class lifestyle. I had been content with what we had, happy with our simple life. How dare he suggest that I couldn't be trusted with the knowledge of wealth? My face must have shown my offense because Robert quickly raised his hands in a gesture of peace. He didn't mean it as an insult, he insisted. He meant that he had been afraid money would change us, both of us, our relationship, our values, our sense of who we were. We had built our marriage on working together, being partners in struggle and success. We had taken pride in being responsible, in saving carefully, in teaching our children the value of hard work and modest living. Sudden wealth threatened all of that. So Robert had made a decision, one he acknowledged was probably wrong, definitely secretive, but that had felt right at the time. He had taken the $3 million inheritance and divided it into parts. The first $1 million went into investments in his name only, conservative mutual funds and bonds that he managed through a separate financial advisor. That money was meant to guarantee our retirement, to ensure we would never be a burden on our children, to provide security for our old age. And that account, he said, now held about $1.4 million after 25 years of growth. The second portion, about $800,000, went into various trusts for our children and grandchildren, structured to pay out when they reached certain ages or achieved certain milestones. Those trusts were managed by a law firm, and our children would eventually learn about them, but not until Robert felt they were mature enough to handle the information responsibly. Some of the trusts had already begun paying out, he admitted, though our children didn't know the money came from their Uncle Thomas or that their father had been managing it all along. And the third portion, the account the auditors were asking about, was meant to be mine. Robert had put $850,000 into an account in my name, planning to tell me about it when he felt the time was right, when he was confident the money wouldn't disrupt our lives or our values. He had made regular deposits not because he was adding money, but because he had started with a smaller opening balance and transferred funds gradually from a holding account, wanting to space out the paper trail for tax purposes on the interest earnings. But years had passed, and the right time never seemed to come. At first, he was waiting for the children to be more settled. Then, he was waiting for his parents to pass so there wouldn't be complications with estate planning. Then he got busy with work, with life, with the comfortable rhythm of our days, and the secret became easier to keep than to reveal. It became something he would tell me later, always later, until later became 23 years of silence. Robert's voice cracked as he finished his explanation. The audit notice had arrived because new federal regulations required banks to verify beneficial ownership on accounts over a certain threshold. The bank had sent him a notice months ago at his office email, the one he set up specifically for financial matters related to the inheritance. He had been working with lawyers to restructure everything properly, to bring it all into the light in a way that wouldn't cause problems with the IRS or with our family. But the process was complicated, and the auditors had apparently decided to contact me directly as the account holder before everything was settled. He hadn't hidden the money to hurt me, Robert insisted, his eyes pleading for understanding. He had hidden it to protect our family, to preserve the values we had built our lives on, to keep wealth from corrupting the relationships we treasured. He understood now that it was a terrible decision, that he should have trusted me, that keeping such a massive secret for so long was a betrayal regardless of his intentions. He was sorry, deeply, profoundly sorry, and he was ready to face whatever consequences came from his choices, but he needed me to know the truth before we walked into that audit appointment. I sat there in our kitchen, the morning light still pale through the windows, and tried to process everything Robert had just told me. My husband had inherited $3 million and hidden it from me for 25 years. He had created secret accounts, set up trusts, managed investments, and built an entire financial structure I knew nothing about. He had made decisions about our family's future without consulting me, without trusting me with information that fundamentally concerned my life as much as his. The money itself almost didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was the lie, or more accurately, the 25 years of omission. The fact that he had looked at me every day for a quarter century and chosen not to tell me something this significant. The fact that he had made assumptions about who I was and what I could handle without giving me the chance to prove him right or wrong. I thought about all those years I had worried about our retirement savings, about whether we would have enough money if one of us got sick, about the modest gifts we gave our grandchildren, because we needed to be practical. All of that worry had been unnecessary. We had been wealthy, or at least Robert had been wealthy, and he had let me live in artificial scarcity while he managed abundance in secret. The anger came then, hot and righteous. It rose up from my chest and into my throat, and I had to clench my jaw to keep from yelling. How dare he, I thought, how dare he make those decisions for me, about me, without me? How dare he assume I was so shallow, so weak, so untrustworthy that I couldn't handle knowledge of wealth? How dare he steal 25 years of financial security from my conscious awareness, letting me worry and scrimp and save when we could have lived differently, helped our children more, enjoyed life with less stress? But under the anger, there was something else, something more complicated. Because as much as I hated what Robert had done, I understood why he had done it. I had seen what money did to people, how it changed relationships and created conflicts. I had watched families torn apart by inheritance disputes. I had seen children of wealthy parents become entitled and aimless. Robert's fear hadn't been irrational. It had been a terrible solution to a real problem, but the problem itself was legitimate. And there was one more thing, one piece of information that shifted my understanding slightly. The account in my name, the $850,000 the auditors were asking about, had always been intended for me. Robert hadn't hidden money to keep it from me. He had hidden money to protect me from what he thought it might do to us. In his misguided, paternalistic, deeply flawed way, he had been trying to take care of me. That realization didn't excuse what he had done. It didn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it complicated my anger, added layers of context that made the situation less black and white than it had seemed when I first opened that audit notice. I finally spoke, my voice steadier than I felt. "Robert," I said, "you stole 25 years from me. 25 years when I could have known we were secure. 25 years when I could have made different choices, pursued different dreams, helped our children differently. You stole that from me because you didn't trust me. You didn't trust us." Robert's face crumpled, and tears ran down his cheeks openly. "I know," he said. "I know, and I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting us, but I was just protecting myself from the hard conversation. I was being a coward. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of decades of deception hanging between us like a physical thing. The coffee pot beeped, its cycle finished, and the sound was jarring in the quiet kitchen. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. Mrs. Chen from across the street was getting her newspaper. The mailman was starting his route. Life was going on, normal and ordinary, while inside this house, everything I thought I knew about my marriage was being restructured. But little did I know, this revelation was only the beginning of the truth. Because that afternoon, when we went together to the audit appointment, I would discover that Robert's brother wasn't the only one who had died with secrets, and the inheritance wasn't the only money that had been hidden. The auditors had questions that Robert couldn't answer, documents that didn't match his story, and evidence that suggested something far more complicated than a brother's legacy being quietly managed. The appointment was in a bland office building downtown, the kind with fluorescent lights and beige carpets that absorbed sound and soul equally. We sat in a conference room with two auditors, a man and a woman in their 40s, who introduced themselves with professional efficiency, but not much warmth. They had folders of paperwork spread across the table, and they started asking questions in a systematic way that made it clear this wasn't just a routine verification. The woman, whose name was Ms. Patterson, asked me to explain my relationship to the account. I told her honestly that I had known nothing about it until the audit notice arrived. She made a note and asked Robert to explain how the account had been funded. He gave his prepared explanation about the inheritance from his brother, providing documentation of Thomas's death and the will that had left him the estate. Ms. Patterson reviewed the documents carefully, comparing them to information in her files. Then she asked a question that made my stomach drop. "The deposits into this account," she said, "don't match the timing or amounts of the inheritance distribution. According to our records, the inheritance was transferred to you in a lump sum in 2001, Mr. Thornton. But the account in your wife's name wasn't opened until January 2002, and the deposits continued quarterly for over 20 years. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Robert shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. He explained about the holding account, about how he had transferred money gradually to minimize attention and manage tax implications on the interest. But Ms. Patterson wasn't satisfied. She pulled out another document, a bank record that showed transfers into the account from multiple sources, not just Robert's holding account. "There are deposits here," she said, pointing to highlighted lines on the printout that came from an account at a different institution entirely, an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Those deposits total nearly $400,000 over the course of 15 years, and they're not connected to your brother's estate. Can you explain where that money came from?" The room went silent. I looked at Robert, whose face had gone pale. He stared at the document like it was written in a language he couldn't read. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice thin. "I never had an offshore account. All the money came from Thomas's inheritance. There must be some mistake in your records." Miss Patterson exchanged a glance with her colleague, the man whose name I had already forgotten in my growing panic. "There's no mistake," she said firmly. "We've traced these transactions carefully. The offshore account was opened in 2003 under a business entity called Thornton Consulting Group. You're listed as the principal owner. The account received regular deposits from various sources over the years and then transferred funds to your wife's domestic account on a quarterly basis." Robert shook his head, insisting he had never heard of Thornton Consulting Group, never opened any offshore account, never had any business entity. But the auditors had documentation, incorporation papers filed in Delaware, bank statements from the Cayman account, and transaction records that traced money flowing from the offshore account into mine. My mind was reeling. If Robert was telling the truth, and he genuinely didn't know about this offshore account, then someone else had been using his identity to move money around. But who? And why? And how did that money end up in an account in my name? The male auditor, whose nameplate I finally focused on enough to read as Mr. Chen, asked a different question. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, "do you have any knowledge of your husband conducting business consulting work outside of his employment at the manufacturing company?" I shook my head. Robert worked at the same place for 37 years. He never did consulting work. He barely used a computer until he retired. "Mr. Chen made a note. We've been able to trace some of the deposits into the offshore account back to their original sources," he said. They came from several companies in the telecommunications and technology sectors, companies that appear to have had business relationships with your late brother-in-law's employer. Does that suggest any connection to you? My heart was pounding now. Thomas had worked in technology. These companies were in technology. The money wasn't just from Thomas's inheritance. It was somehow connected to his work, his business, his life in ways we hadn't understood. Robert looked like he might be sick. He put his hands on the table to steady himself and spoke carefully. My brother died in 2000. If money was being moved around in 2003 and later, it couldn't have been him. He was gone. Ms. Patterson nodded. We're aware of that, which is why we need to understand who actually controlled these accounts and these business entities. The concern from a regulatory standpoint is that this appears to be a sophisticated money laundering operation, using your wife's name as a cover, your brother's estate as an excuse, and offshore structures to obscure the true source of funds. If either of you were involved knowingly, there are serious legal consequences. If you were victims of identity theft or fraud, we need to establish that clearly so we can investigate appropriately. The words money laundering hung in the air like an accusation. I felt dizzy, like the room was tilting. This couldn't be happening. I was a 62-year-old retired librarian's assistant. I had never broken a law in my life beyond maybe rolling through a stop sign. And now I was sitting in a federal office being questioned about offshore accounts and money laundering. Robert reached across the table and took my hand, his grip tight and desperate. We didn't do anything wrong, he said to the auditors. I inherited money from my brother legally, and I put it in accounts for my family. If someone created false documents or moved money around using our information, we're victims here, not criminals. Ms. Patterson's expression softened slightly. We believe you, she said, which is why we're having this conversation instead of bringing in law enforcement immediately. But we need your cooperation to figure out what actually happened. We need access to all your financial records, your brother's estate documents, any communication you have related to these accounts. And we need you to work with investigators to trace how your identities might have been compromised. We agreed, of course. What choice did we have? They gave us a list of documents to provide and scheduled another meeting for the following week. As we left that office building, walking into afternoon sunshine that felt surreal after the fluorescent lighting and serious accusations, I felt like my entire life had been picked up and shaken until nothing fit together properly anymore. Robert drove us home in silence, his hands tight on the steering wheel. I stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass by, and tried to make sense of what we had just learned. The inheritance story that had seemed so shocking that morning now felt almost quaint compared to the possibility of identity theft, fraud, and money laundering. Someone had been using our names, our information, possibly my brother-in-law's death, to move money around in ways that were very illegal. And somehow, that money had ended up in an account in my name, making me look like either a criminal or a fool. When we got home, Robert went straight to his office and started pulling out every financial document we had, every piece of paper related to Thomas's estate, anything that might help the auditors understand what had happened. I made coffee, my hands moving on autopilot, while my mind spun with questions and fears. The phone rang around dinner time. It was Emily, our youngest, calling to chat about her day at work. I tried to sound normal, asked the right questions about her projects and her coworkers, but I felt like I was acting in a play, reading lines that belonged to someone else's life. How could I tell my daughter that her father had hidden a multi-million-dollar inheritance for 25 years? How could I explain that we were now under investigation for possible money laundering? The words didn't exist for that kind of conversation. After I hung up, I found Robert still in the office, surrounded by papers, his face haggard with stress. We need a lawyer, I said. We need someone who understands financial crimes and can help us prove we didn't do anything wrong. Robert nodded without looking up. I already called David, he said quietly. He's an attorney, even if corporate law isn't his specialty. He's looking into who we should hire for this situation. David, our oldest son, the one who had followed a practical path into law school and built a solid career at a respectable firm. Now we were going to have to tell him about his uncle's inheritance, his father's secret accounts, and the federal investigation that threatened to upend our lives. The shame of that conversation felt almost worse than the fear of legal consequences. That night, lying in bed unable to sleep, I replayed the audit meeting in my mind, trying to remember every detail. Something Ms. Patterson had said kept nagging at me. She had mentioned that the companies sending money to the offshore account had business relationships with Thomas's employer. Thomas had worked for a telecommunications software company that went public and made him wealthy. What if the money in the offshore account wasn't illegal at all? What if it was also somehow connected to Thomas, to his work, to something legitimate that just looked suspicious because of how it had been structured? I got up quietly, trying not to wake Robert, and went downstairs to the computer. I started searching for information about Thomas's company, trying to find news articles or records from the late 90s and early 2000s. The internet wasn't as comprehensive back then as it became later, but there were still traces of information available. I found an archived article from a tech industry magazine about Thomas's company going public in 1998. The article mentioned key employees who had become wealthy from their stock options, and Thomas's name was there, listed as a senior engineer. But another paragraph caught my attention. The article discussed how the company had structured compensation packages that included deferred bonuses and consulting fees paid out over several years after the IPO, designed to retain key employees and manage tax obligations. Consulting fees. The offshore account had been called Thornton Consulting Group. What if Thomas had set up that entity himself, legally, to receive those deferred payments? What if he had structured it in a way that would benefit Robert after his death, knowing he had no other heirs? The timing would fit. Thomas died in 2000. The company would have continued paying out deferred compensation according to contracts that predated his death. Those payments might have gone into accounts or entities that Thomas had created, which then transferred to Robert as his heir. But if that was true, why were the auditors so concerned? Why did it look like money laundering instead of legitimate inheritance? The answer, I realized, was probably because no one had properly documented the transfer of these assets when Thomas died. If Thomas had set up offshore structures for tax planning, common enough in that era for tech workers with stock options, and if those structures continued operating after his death without clear documentation that Robert was now the rightful owner, it would look exactly like someone illegally using Robert's identity to move money around. The thought that we might be victims of Thomas's inadequate estate planning rather than criminals or fraud victims was almost funny, except nothing about this situation was actually funny. But it was a theory, a possible explanation that could be investigated and potentially verified. I spent the rest of the night researching, printing articles, making notes. By the time Robert came downstairs at dawn, I had assembled a timeline of Thomas's company, its compensation structures, and the likely flow of deferred payments that might have continued after his death. Robert looked at my work with tired eyes that gradually brightened with hope. "This could explain it," he said. "This could prove we didn't do anything wrong." We called David first thing in the morning, explained my research, and asked him to find us a lawyer who specialized in both estate planning and financial regulatory issues. Within 48 hours, we were sitting in another conference room, this time with an attorney named Patricia Wu, who looked fierce and competent in a way that made me feel slightly less terrified. Ms. Wu reviewed all our documentation, listened to our story, examined my research about Thomas's company, and spent several hours asking detailed questions about everything we knew. Then she made some phone calls, talked to the auditors, and arranged for additional time to investigate before any final determinations were made. Over the next 3 weeks, Ms. Wu's team did what the auditors should have done from the beginning. They traced every dollar back to its source. They found Thomas's estate planning documents, including paperwork about the offshore consulting entity he had set up legally with the help of tax attorneys when his company went public. They found contracts for deferred compensation that predated his death. They found documentation of how those structures were supposed to transfer to his heirs, though the documentation had been incomplete and poorly executed after Thomas died unexpectedly. They also found that Robert's inheritance lawyer, the one who had handled Thomas's estate back in 2001, had been disbarred 5 years later for mishandling client funds. That lawyer had apparently set up some of the transfer mechanisms for the deferred payments, but had failed to file proper paperwork with the banks, the IRS, and the offshore jurisdictions. When those payments started flowing through years later, they looked suspicious because no one could trace them back to their legitimate origin without extensive forensic accounting. In other words, we were victims of incompetent legal work compounded by Thomas's sudden death, not perpetrators of financial crimes. The money was all legitimate, all rightfully Robert's as Thomas's heir, but it had been so poorly documented that it looked illegal to modern regulators applying new transparency standards. The relief I felt when Ms. Wu explained this to us was overwhelming. We weren't